this distinguished panel is going to help us work through the various implications of the legalization of cannabis in Canada and talk about how it's being handled by various sports organizations. So I'm going to start first with Sarah, who's with the Canadian Olympic Committee, and tell us what the impact of decriminalization has been at both the COC, Canadian Olympic Committee level, and the IOC, and for athletes that are competing on the world stage.
So I think we were among those that raised our hands to the second question, because at first it was not so obvious for our organization what the impact of decriminalization would have. Soon enough, we had to ask ourselves those questions and to try to find answers, because athletes were asking the questions as well as our national sports organization. And quite frankly, I would say it's a year after, it's been a bit over a year, and not much has changed for us. Quite simply, from an athlete's perspective, the reason why it hasn't changed is because our athletes, when they compete on the world stage and when they compete at the Olympic Games, they are subject to the World Anti-Doping Code and all prohibitions in terms of consumption of performance enhancement drugs. And to this day, cannabis is still considered on the prohibited list for what is called in-competition testing. There are two types of tests, outside of competition and then during competition. And cannabis is still a prohibited substance for in-competition testing. And the second reason why it hasn't impacted the way we treat this prohibition is because while it may now be legal in Canada to consume, it's still very much illegal in a lot of the countries where we do compete. If we look towards the next Olympic Games destination, Tokyo, in 2020. In Japan, it can be up to 5 years imprisonment for a possession or distribution of cannabis. And that's certainly not a position we would want any of our athletes to be put into. So what it means for us is that we put a lot of our efforts toward education, awareness, and making sure that our delegation know of their obligations and they can make an informed decision as to how they go about it.
What is the official position taken by the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports, and share with us how that body governs and enforces drug violations in Canada? Because I think some of us kind of wonder how it interfaces with WADA.
Yep. So for those of you who may not know who CCS is, they are the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports, and they are what is considered under the World Anti-Doping Code a NATO, so a National Anti-Doping Organization, and they are responsible for the implementation of the Canadian Anti-Doping Program. As a signatory of the code, they cannot go and prescribe different regulations than what the World Anti-Doping Code says, so they have to align themselves with the rules that are prevalent on a worldwide basis, and they actually implement the program in Canada according to those international standards and rules. The CCES has expressed in the past, and I don't want to speak on their behalf, but they have expressed in the past some hesitation in terms of whether cannabis should be considered performance-enhancing substance. That said, there have been some accounts of individual athletes who may have said that, well, it's not helping their performance, it's helping their recovery, stress management, anxiety, and so forth. So for a substance to be considered a prohibited substance, it needs to meet 3 criteria. It needs to be performance enhancement and or be harmful to health and or being contrary to the spirit of sport. So based on these 3 criteria, the World Anti-Doping Agency still consider cannabis to meet at least 2 of these 3 criteria. From the health perspective, we could say or argue that cannabis is harmful to the youth. So from that perspective, it's still a good rationale to keep it prohibited. As well as you can imagine, someone being impaired in certain sports may create a risk for themselves as well as with other athletes on the field of play. So these, from a health perspective, are other reasons why it's still considered. So that would be, I don't want to speak on CCS behalf, but they have a mitigated position in terms of cannabis as a substance. That said, they are enforcing the regulations as an adult in Canada.